Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of Making the Rounds. I am here with League of Emily, who has a job this year. Anyway.
My God. Uh,
But
it was touch and go there for a
unrelated.
minute, you know? No.
Unrelated. So that's a fun one. But today we're basically going to see about doing a little bit something different for the show. Um, and focusing a bit more on broader, wider topics because I think that there's a condensation of shows that go over game after game, talk about player after player, and all those things. And also, as you get older, you care way less about that. You care more about other ecosystem things, hence the job comment. Anyway,
Her.
true story that it is more relevant at that point. So the first thing we wanted to discuss was more or less the week one takeaways of LEC. Kind of get that out of the way as the hook where people think we're gonna actually talk about the games, and then after that topic, just completely derail and not talk about the games. So anyway, Emily, what when I say like week one, what happened? How do you feel about LEC so far?
Um, it's been really interesting to watch how people are. So, like, again, this is where I'm going to give
Mm-hmm.
an answer that, like, everyone's going to hate because I'm sure people want to be like, whoa, Carmine Corp or 03, whoa, SK or
Yeah.
3-0, right? And just watching SK's game was actually pretty interesting because um, I think one of the things talking to a lot of LCS players, specifically LCS top laners during Asset Day, people are like, what is top lane going to look like, right? Is it going to be
Yeah.
an island where it's just whoever gets the freeze off first and that's going to be really fucking boring? Are we just going to go ham and be contesting the wave before it even gets there because now it's just a 1v1 and you're not expecting as much jungle intervention? And until today, G2 were actually heavily focusing top side. Broken Blade had a pretty high like top jungle procs in his first two games, especially the second one, I believe. So it's been really interesting for me to see in the SK game how early topside attention ended up panning out for Irrelevant and the Jax because once he got ahead, obviously then Jax can kind of take over even when Fnatic were trying to make plays in side lanes. But then additionally, how teams have interpreted taking grubs,
Yeah.
where the mites come in, how important is that versus dragon stacking?
Mm-hmm.
And I'd argue as the game goes on, I still think Drake stacking is going to be a lot more important, and grubs are going to be kind of just a like, oh, we're going to hit level 6, but we're not really giving a ton of topside attention. I think the mites are cool, but they're kind of a waste if you don't have a lane that you can push with them, right? So like otherwise it's just an XP gain and you don't get the full advantage out of using those with a pushing lane where you can actually hit turret in the time frame. So that's something that was really interesting to just see like not only the whoopsies, like the rift, the like Caps' Rift Herald, obviously on day one. I think everyone thought that was pretty funny, but like, how are we going to be playing the map going forward? And I still think what we're going to end on is the iteration where it's like maybe you give top lane an early gank to set up your top laner ahead because it is a bigger 1v1 environment, or it can be because of the way the entry points changed. But on the whole, it's still about having push bot. It's still going to be about Drake stacking. It's still going to be about like pushing waves, especially on the bot side. So I don't think the actual look of how people play the game is going to change that much once everything settles, based on what I saw in week one of LEC. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but like that's where I think we're still going to end up.
So I think the way that week one is always you're always gonna be really slow to adjust to how the game is played because I think it's always kind of scary to be the first team doing something.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of teams will say, okay, but who else is doing this or XYZ. I think in general, thanks for the raid, veteran, appreciate it. In general, I think that the I actually think the grubs are significant, but if you deny getting 5 or 6 grubs, they're way less useful. So I do think we'll see like still swaps like early back on 430 or something like this. And then we'll see like a support going top, or we'll see someone going top just to
Yeah.
make sure that the one team is not securing all 6 or all 5 grubs. So I think that that's the biggest thing for me that will happen with it, and I think that that will still matter a lot, and that will end up being a focal point. And it's almost just kind of like going from the perspective of, okay, we have sorry, I'm reading chat. I should not read chat. We go from the perspective of really, really focusing bot. There's first back timer, which will be pretty consistent across the board.
Mm-hmm.
Like on bot lane, you can back pretty easily after you getting those waves in. Is used to kind of deny full grubs taken, and then nothing will sort of happen after that. I think the main thing also after that is just seeing more people streamline for bot dives or set those up or playing around bot more consistently. It's very funny because the very first day, right, we had all 5 blue side wins, and everyone's like, "Oh yeah, this is predicted. You know, it's impossible to play bot lane from red side in 2024." But after that, we actually had a pretty decent mix with more red side teams winning towards the back half. So it's interesting that so far we haven't seen like the massive side disparity that is kind of predicted to happen. But it will be more bot focused, right? That's kind of how I feel
Mm-hmm.
about it. That will be the same.
Yeah. And I think like for people who are hoping that everything would kind of explode,
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing you have to remember when you look at how League of Legends is played is we're just at a state where like every person is aware of how important it is to have pushing lanes at times. So like you're not going to give up something like that for a super risky off meta pick unless you really really have like a clear idea of how you want to play that pick or that comp out. I do think it was interesting that we saw
Mm-hmm.
no one risk picking Hui. It was played in LCK Challengers last night
Yeah.
by Kiahu. He went 1-1 on it, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. But I was actually really curious to see if anyone would take the risk on it because it seems to me like, again, and this is from talking to players just about him, his matchups, his damage, etc., that he absolutely can take over a game, but the players in general were waiting to see how the pace of the game, because like the pace of the game has been very quick
Mm-hmm.
in scrims. And bringing him out to stage, he requires a little bit more time to actually do the massive amounts of damage that he can do. I also think just as we have players get more and more comfortable with him, you'll see people willing to take that risk and maybe not have as big of a push in mid, because you do have to factor that in when playing Hui as well with a lot of his matchups. But I was not necessarily surprised, but I was kind of hoping that an LEC mid would kind of throw him in there and see how he fit, or that a team would like risk having a comp that would have him succeed.
I think the perception of Wei is that he's too much work to be really good at, and when he's really good, he's oppressive. But otherwise, like you miss your spells and fights, and then the fight is just over. Right?
Yeah.
That's more or less kind of the perception of Wei at the moment. So from that perspective, you do kind of have to be more risk prone to play him. I do think we'll see more people play him over time, but he also suffers from the champion release during World Syndrome, which means I don't know, those champs always just get forgotten for ages anyway. So we'll see. I was like really high on Hui, and I still think Hui's really good, but we'll see if he actually gets played in pro.
Yeah. I think he can be super super
Yeah.
strong. It's just you have to be really comfortable with playing him, and you have to be willing to know when you're not going to have the push in mid for your jungler and the rest of your team.
Yeah, but I mean, Akali is arguably the most impressive
Yeah, that's
champion in
true
the game at
too.
the moment, and she doesn't get pushed. So it just, to me, like
Fuck
the
Akali.
argument that oh, you don't get push is not really a real argument when Akali is just disgusting. And I think Hui can be on a similar level. So yeah, that's sort of where I am there. And I don't think Hui's wave clear is even that bad. And Akali has like stupid trade potential for the lack of wave clear she has early. So she
Yeah.
does still play competitively in the first 3 levels, despite what you would expect. So yeah. Anyway, good times. In terms of the overall takeaways, though, I am here to have the terrible the exciting gut reactions, which is you should be a Mad Lion fan, Mad Lions fan, big times. I mean, they basically kept the core of the team that was promoted, and they have effectively just like done very well for the first week. I think people didn't expect them to win at least 2 of the games that they played. So Mad Lions is really fun, and I'm gonna kind of be one of those. I think if part of an LEC team or part of an ERL team or part of an NACL team gets promoted to as a core to LCS, I will always root for that team, like almost always.
Mm.
So I'm gonna probably be a Mad Lions fan for a while. SK is also like very surprising. I think SK is slightly more surprising just because on paper, like you could argue on paper Mad's roster is terrible, but on paper I'm slightly more familiar with some of those players and also not as high on them. But they have very good, like they have good synergy on paper for a rookie roster, right? So
Hmm.
that's like not completely rookie, but you know what I mean. Like they have Niski who will make like younger junglers always look good. They have like Exekick who I think was a bit underrated in the past. They have a few other decent pieces. So even though they have a lot of players that might not look good on paper, like DOS, I think they round out okay, and they could have a good roster of pieces that function well together, right? So I think that type of roster will always do well at the start of the split.
Yeah. I was gonna say this is where you're gonna have to carry me because I'm not as familiar with a lot of the um
Mhm.
EU Masters players who are
Yep.
coming up into the scene. The two that people kind of told me to watch out for were Jackie's and Merwin. And Merwin is really interesting looking into
Mhm.
like some of the shit he's thrown in there. So uh I like those kind of players who again are just willing to play some weird shit either for a laning matchup or just for a team comp. So I hope we see some of that from him as well in on the LEC stage.
Yep. I've had so much fun watching EU, and I think the biggest reason why is just the fan engagement is super
Mhm.
exciting, and the way that it's just like they're organically able to create these rivalries with the teams that they have, with Casey existing, with Mad going like all Spanish, and then tap into the big streamer communities. I think co-stream on like a per language basis is huge. It has been huge for a while, but now we're actually able to see it as English language fans because you couldn't really co-stream in English before for LEC. So we'll see a little bit more of that from our side, and it's funny to see like Ebi throwing shade at Yamato Cannon, and just stuff like that is just super fun. I don't know. And then they couldn't interview the player. They couldn't interview Elioya at the end of the game because the
Yeah.
fans were just so hype and it was too loud and the mics were picking it
It's
up.
great.
So, I mean, that shit is very fun.
Yeah, I
Um,
remember like I don't know if this is
mhm.
kind of a good segue into uh I don't know if this topic is in order, but um
It is.
like just
I
yeah,
made
it
it
is.
very
Okay,
intentionally.
awesome. Yeah,
I
I
made
look
it
back
very
at the list.
intentionally
Okay,
like
cool.
that. Cool.
Amazing, amazing segue. Great job,
Yeah.
Kelsey. So like I remember back when and obviously this team did not pan out, but I remember when Schalke joined and everyone was like, why are you joining? Like, because initially they did ERLs first.
Hmm.
And it was like, okay, why are you doing this when LEC exists?
Yep.
Right. And I think the biggest success around a lot of these dream like because they're kind of streaming orgs, they're rooted in a lot of country specific nationalism that also leans into the way that traditional sports are kind of set up in Europe a lot of the time. And that is the best way to go about things because the framework for fandom is incredibly similar.
Mhm.
So it's already part of the way that you root for something, or like part of the way that you've been raised to root for something. Um, and if you can accomplish that organically in a more organic manner, it can be incredibly successful. And obviously, it took a few years to get there, like to continue to iterate on. And it's not like everything's rosy. Obviously, we just
Yep.
saw like one of the larger French orgs leave this past off season as well. But I do think in terms of fandom and the way that regionality works by country in Europe, the way that the EU masters have set up as a feeder into LEC over the past like year or so for fandom is really impressive. And I also did want to shout out um some of this came during the pauses,
Mhm.
but a lot of it was just part of some of the programming that they want to do in between games. The broadcast itself is leaning heavily into bringing a lot of these voices into the broadcast. And it's the first time I've really seen that wide of a
Yep.
representation of like all of the different countries and different languages that follow LEC. And I think it's very, very smart of them to further lean into it. And it makes the most of
Yep.
the amazing broadcast team that they already have in place.
I remember when the announcement, this was 20, I want to say this was like start of 2017, right? When they announced franchising for, or I guess it was end of 2017, when they announced franchising for LCS, and they
Mhm.
said, with LEC, we're not going to do a franchising model. We're going to, and it was EU LCS at the time, we're going to do more of a region based model where, within the teams, the LCS or the EU LCS teams represent a certain region, and there's still promotion and relegation feeding directly from the ERLs. And that system ultimately got rejected because the ownership groups for the EULCS felt that it devalued the LCS slots compared to the NALCS slots, right? Because it's like you're in their minds, the LCS slots, they're permanent, they're guaranteed, they're far more valuable than the EULCS slots because of promotion relegation. So you actually saw a lot of EULCS teams applying to join LCS
Yep.
franchising because of that announcement, right? So they ended up walking it back. And I think what you ultimately get is you saw the ERLs as a result almost kind of thrive independently. And
Yep.
now, with the existence of these teams, with teams having less money, with the salary caps existing, we are getting a pseudo proxy for sort of what it would be like if promotion and relegation existed, with the teams that are basically staying faithful to their rosters because of the fact that, um, there's no money. Like, that's the real answer, right?
Yeah.
There's not a lot of money, so they're actually giving back more to the players who earned the spot or who are buying in, who are already existing on the roster that they had. So you'll
Mhm.
have situations like that more frequently if that continues. And if slots get sold, but it's not going to happen organically the way it would in the other way. And I was actually really excited about that system because I think that a system is exciting for viewers. It is a little bit of a nightmare logistically because I remember I was talking about joining H2K at the time, and a lot of it was like everyone wanted to declare for the UK. Like all of the orgs wanted to declare for the UK, pretty much. Some orgs wanted to declare for Germany, obviously, but it was like this kind of weird situation where it's suddenly we're declaring for a region, and that
Yeah.
felt a little bit forced or fake. But it was there was like a lot of I like the idea. The ideas behind it were very cool, and it was a system that I actually thought was interesting, though it had a lot of problems. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it is. I really appreciate the broadcast leaning into it. I
Mhm.
really appreciate the fan culture around a lot of these teams. And it just feels, yeah, it feels organic. It does not feel like
Mhm.
this is being forced because we're trying to grow a fan base here. Which is pleasant and really fun to watch.
Yeah. And it's the idea that the teams that are buying into the league are more, and we're kind of seeing this with Shopify because they do have a big content arm attached with like Moist
Hmm.
Critical and Ludwig. So we're kind of seeing it with Shopify. We're kind of seeing it with like Disguised expressing interest in getting into LCS, where you are getting like these community fandoms, and you have eBay attached to some of these or one of these orgs and things like this. That's has like a similar vibe, but it will obviously be even more exacerbated because of the language element, because of the local element, because of the fact that you have brands that are very specific to countries that
Yeah.
you don't necessarily have in the US. So that stuff it's just like an ecosystem that should have been drawn on for years and years and years, and I'm kind of surprised it took this long for it to be a bigger deal, I guess.
I don't know if you want to talk about NA here,
Sure,
but
I'm down.
I mean, I think because
Hmm.
a lot of this came from the way that the franchising model was adopted in Europe. A lot of the fandom part comes from existing fan culture. Um, and
Yep.
I know we talked about this during Demacia Cup, but like, I feel like now a lot of people in North America are looking over and being like, okay, uh, franchising is interesting. And then additionally, our entire tier two and amateur system has kind of been undercut
Yep.
for years, right? Like
Hmm.
when initially it started and we did have promotion relegation, what was actually happening a lot of the time was that the a team would just sign enough players that had either been in the LCS before, or they knew could qualify them for the LCS, and then they would sell the spot, right?
Hmm.
And that kind of became the meta for a little while. Um, in addition to just not having a lot of organic growth in the US overall, and I'm talking about the US specifically. Obviously, um, Canada, I can't speak to as well because I am not Canadian, despite Raz saying that I am several times
Is
as
it
a joke.
because you apologize all
Uh,
the time, or what?
yes, and I also think it's because I have a slight northern accent from living in Vermont.
Sure.
But the the big thing with North America is like you said, you were surprised that it took this long for kind of leaning into regionality that already existed from traditional sports um, to matriculate into the LEC. Uh, in the US specifically, it's a
Hmm.
lot different because it's pretty much collegiate and high school athletics into um into pro,
Yep.
depending on the sport, right? And like I think one of the biggest things for collegiate is obviously NCAA football, which is in and of itself its own like massive billion-dollar industry.
Hmm.
Um, and we didn't really lean in on any existing infrastructure because a lot of our traditional sports infrastructure is based on geolocation from
Yep.
like a familial perspective, um or alternatively depending on how big the sport gets, like as a joke kind of, but also just because I am actually a Packers fan. This is a Bart Starr jersey for people that don't know. Maybe you don't know US football, I don't know.
Cubby said he
But I
liked
grew
your
up in
shirt in chat, so
nice.
there you go. Yeah.
I grew up in, and they just won yesterday,
Hmm.
unexpectedly. But the I grew up uh watching football because my mom watched football, and she was a huge Patriots
Yep.
fan. The Patriots sucked when I was a kid, so I was like, okay, this guy can throw the ball really far. And like when you're 6, you don't understand what defense is. You just want someone that looks cool and throws the ball really far. Or in my brother's case, because he liked Emmett Smith and he ended up liking the Cowboys because the Cowboys were pretty good when we were younger. He's like, oh, this guy can run really fast. Like, I want to do that. So if you're and my mom kind of didn't care as much about football as she did about us following the Red Sox. So we weren't like funneled into that avenue. So when something gets as big as NFL football, it can transcend regionality, but for the most part, I was trying to think of like how you'd even organically come up
Do it
with a sport
yeah.
now in the US because it'd be really difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is the server population for North America just doesn't support a regional system, right? And I think
Yeah.
the other element of it is that we're constantly kind of underpinning the tier 2 scene, which is where you build a lot of those. Because I would say, like, in China, they have the City of Heroes, which is under the LDL, which is the secondary league, and that is very regional based. And that's like very much based on sectors and things like this. So I think it's of the country, and there's like obviously very unique cultures within like each of the Chinese like subregions, which is like a completely different topic, but you can kind of see the same sort of idea, right? In terms of how those things happen. And the biggest limitation in those areas is basically internet access and consistency of internet connection across all those regions. But again, much different topic. So I think those all kind of exist somewhat organically and are supported by, in part, a larger server pop. I think the most that you could do, and I remember, forget who it was. I think it was actually Loco Doco who had this idea of an East versus a West league, where it was like you just have East versus West conference, and you just have East teams and West teams, and that would be the extent that you can do like a regionalization, because most of our populations are in cities on East and West Coast. So
Yeah.
that would be the extent that you could do it, but even then, a big concern was just population to have top teams in both regions, right? If you look at the LCS now, most people are, and we'll probably get to this later. Most people are gonna see like, oh, it's C9 and everyone else, and then going even deeper like that. I think though the thing that makes most sense culturally for us is obviously the collegiate system. You mentioned the Red Sox. For me, which I grew up in Colorado, so this is a little bit weird, but my parents were both from Ohio. So it was OSU, right? Ohio State
Yep.
University. That was the team we followed. We didn't follow the Browns, like fuck the Browns. We followed
Fair.
we followed Ohio State University football, right? So, and then there's one development, and you mentioned like the NCAA, is teams paying salaries for coaching staff, for example, an NCAA that is just ridiculously exorbitant and justifies like going to coach for a collegiate team because of the boosters compared to going to coach for an NFL league, right? And they actually have like clauses in their contracts where they can't coach for NFL for like a full year after their terms end or things like this, right? So you actually have situations like that exist in the collegiate space, because the collegiate space is kind of a lot of where you get a lot of the regional pride, because it starts out as like a school or a university system, and our school and university system has just constantly been underpinned. I would say that a lot of people are going to be flocking to it because the secondary league is also being underpinned, and it is just a very much like the opposite of a trickle down effect where
Yeah.
yeah, if things are bad at the top, everything stays the same at the top, and the bottom is what gets cut, right? So it's we'll see how it goes, but it's very difficult to implement a regional system at the moment in North America. So I see a lot of people suggesting it. I always kind of rib Kangas because he's one of the guys who's really into like the regional system and going by state, and he's from Minnesota. I'm just like, yeah, how many views did your Minnesota league get, Kangas?
Yeah.
it's not a lot, right? There's not, the fan base isn't fragmented enough that I do think you can kind of go on a by player representation if you want to, and really highlight more of their backstory, as opposed to having a team represent a state or something like that. You could have a player represent, like I think Blabber's from Maryland, right? How many people even know that? Stuff like that. And then if you do go through the collegiate system, like what college system did you go through? things like this, I think are more doable to do on a by player system and generate fans in a different way from that perspective. But it has to kind of start more granular for the LCS.
Yeah, like this is kind of a tangent,
Yeah.
but it has to do with a lot of the stuff that we're now seeing be LCS problems
Mm-hmm.
in that like if you are a young person and you have a myriad of options in front of you or a ton of video games
Yep.
to play, um why would you pick League of Legends over something that is not on PC and much easier to access and much cheaper? But it say we'll just like do away with that part. The next thing would be like, why would I play League of Legends when
Yep.
everyone else around me is not playing League of Legends? And like, who am I looking up to be like, I really like this person? Like, if you talk to a lot of players in the league right now, they'll name either like retired NA pros or really good South Korean players.
Yeah.
And in those regions, like in Korea, in China, you actually see like tangible waves of players who are inspired to play by a certain
Yeah.
player that like for example, the Shy is the more recent one where so many top laners coming up are like I want to be the Shy. Now a lot of like super young top laners are looking at Bin and they're like I want to be like Bin.
Mm-hmm.
Clear Love inspired a wave of junglers in China. Mako inspired a wave of supports. Similarly, like Mata inspired a wave of supports. Faker has obviously been inspiring mid laners, continues to inspire mid laners. Um, you have so many
Yep.
examples of Uzi inspired AD carries. I can't believe I
I
almost
mean,
forgot
I
that
would
one.
say the ADC was the original one, and it was actually Wei Xiao, right? Like everyone wanted to be
Yeah,
like Wei
that's true too.
Xiao. That was you had like UCI and everyone on coming up, and it was originally we were known like China was known as the AD carrier region. It's not
Hmm.
anymore, but that was the big thing, and I think a lot of that started just because for a while you could argue that Wei Xiao was like the best player in the world, right? So
Yeah.
a very brief period of
Um,
time now in the context of all history, but yeah.
well, no, I mean, I also remember
Yeah.
that because I'm old. But
Mhm.
like over in Europe, you also saw it with caps and the whole
Yep.
like. I know the EU mids man thing was a meme, but it also was kind of true, where
Yep.
you have someone who's really good at the top of your ladder, and that will inspire younger people. But they have to be seeing that person play. They have to have an avenue to play. And I think in the constant undercutting of our tier 2 scene, that is also what we're losing, right? Like we're
Yep.
losing that kind of organic inspiration that happens. And I know like esports is not the only thing that this is happening to. Just now, just because I'm super into figure skating, the Canadian Nationals happened and the stands were like empty. And it was really, really sad because Canada used to produce like a ton of really, really
Yep.
good, especially single skaters. And so this led to people being like, why is this the case? And it's a very similar thing where like if a sport is expensive and difficult to do and there are just easier cheaper options in front of you where more of your friends are playing, like one of the reasons why I didn't become, not that I would have been good enough, but like I didn't even pursue doing it even though I wanted to, was because my parents were like, hey, you can either play with your friends or you can be alone but be a really good figure skater. And I was like, well, okay, I'd rather play soccer with my friends, right? I'd rather have
Hmm.
some semblance of a social life. And for League of Legends, I feel like the fewer, like it's kind of like you said, it's the reverse like trickle down effect, or it's like the fewer NA pros on the ladder that you have to inspire you, the fewer younger people are going to be inspired to
Yeah.
go pro in League. And this is from years and years and years and years of North America undercutting its own tier 2 system or not leaning into existing systems, like not setting up something in high schools and collegiate from the get go. Um, is yeah, like and then to add on to what you said, like a lot of it is also server population and the fact that the
Yep.
US is a massive country, like land mass wise.
And I think one thing that's super underrated is you talked about when there was promotion relegation in NA. But at that same time, when there was promotion relegation in EU, you still saw teams of like young rookies getting promoted to the LEC. Whereas in
Mhm.
NA, it became almost all about buy some Koreans to come here and put them with like ex C9 players and do a farm team, sell the spot, make money,
Yep.
right? And that was basically also choking out all of the young teams that could have potentially done it. Like the fact that you had teams physically loaning double lifts to not get relegated. Like there was just a lot of loopholes that benefited one, the existing orgs, and two were like completely monetary based incentives, which the revenue model in the NA scene was selling spots, selling players, selling all of these things, and that's not really a revenue model for obvious reasons, but it's basically how teams were making money at the time. So I think that that's a big difference, and I think a big reason why you didn't have the rookies able to compete was our solo queue does suck. So the
Yep.
only way to actually learn the game is by playing competitive. So very fresh players to the comp scene will always have a lot of experience gap or a lot of skill gap initially, and I think that that's changing a lot because I've done a lot with like the combines and all of these things in off season, and the overall level of newer players to tier 2 has risen over time. Like it's drastically risen in the past like 5 years since I've been here. Like it's crazy because you get these players and it's, oh, they actually can plan already. They know what planning is. I don't have to explain it to them. Like they come up with a game plan. They plan almost better than my LCS team. Like there's stories, but because I mean we can talk about that another time. But we can, but that's more to praise the players, right, than to like shit on LCS players. It's more to
Yeah.
praise the players coming up. And I think that that's, and again, you hear a lot more stories now because teams don't have tier 2 systems of, okay, if a player tier 2 teams, if a player gets sick, they just sub in like a random player from amateur or NACL, and suddenly that guy looks good in LCS scrims, right? Those stories are
Mhm.
just way more common now. So I think that's another thing. So it's kind of sad because I feel like the overall level of tier 2 and tier 3 has improved, but now these ecosystems are getting significantly less support, basically at the same
Yeah.
time. Also at the
I also
time when tier 1 has receiving significantly less support or at least funding. So it's
Mhm.
like in theory you'd want tier 2 players to come up and be competitive with tier 1. This would be a good time to promote tier 2 players, but we lost like half of the mids that should have started this year to retirement, and now it's kind of like, how do we build a roster? Which, it's the next topic. I assume you're about to say something related to it. So
yeah. I was actually, because I thought another good segue, let's try this out here, was because you said, okay, if you want to be a fan of a team in LEC, like to root for, Mad is a really good team because obviously they kind of promoted
mhm.
together. It's the Spanish speaking roster experiment. They have a lot of really fun players. Um, I think one of the added things that you're seeing hopefully a little bit more from the NRG roster experiment slash the fact that they actually stuck with some of those players for as long as they did was that you also need to give grace to North American players to make mistakes and not just boot them as soon as they make a single mistake on the LCS stage, right? And NRG is a really good example of that. They just I'll use this to talk about their roster build because I actually do
Mhm.
think it has a very express, like, we are sticking with four of the core people who won us a title. Um and then we are adding Kuhi, who is someone who has,
Arguably that's
I'm
when
not
you
gonna
fire
say,
them, logistically speaking, after they win the title, because then their next year's not going to be as good. That's usually how it works.
there
Anyway,
you go.
continue.
We'll see how well energy does. But yeah, like adding Kuhi is really interesting to me because he has been such a strong voice on a lot of his teams, including his last team, Golden Guardians. I think he has a really, really, really strong understanding of the game.
Mhm.
That's not always reflected in some of his engages, but have always, like, obviously anyone who's ever followed anything I've ever written knows that I've been a Huhi enjoyer since he was a mid laner, because of the way that he saw the map, and a lot of risks that he took back on CLG. uh but yeah, actually, now that I think about it, it's kind of a returning home for him. Not only is he reuniting with FBI, but he's returning to CLG in a way, I
Kind
guess.
of, yeah.
Not really, but we'll go with it. Anyway, I think the logic behind this is you have incredibly smart veteran support reuniting with his old bot lane partner, so you're going to be relying on that pre-existing synergy in addition to the pre-existing synergy of the current NRG core. And we'll see if it works.
Yeah, I'm actually very surprised because I think the biggest reason why the energy roster stayed together is because people aren't buying players now. They're not like doing buyouts because otherwise, given the way energy is positioned at the moment and the layoffs they've had and kind of the restructuring they've done, you would think that this would be a good time for them to sell their players while the stocks are up. But normally that's what we would see in the past, and I assume it's because almost no one was like paying buyouts this off season. And I think that was a big reason why we didn't see any turnover on the energy roster, other than obviously Ignar heading to LEC. So yeah, fun times. I think that is the question though, is like how do you build a team? Because at this point, I think we've had so many years where every LCS org's strategy was we're gonna buy the perceived best players and we're going to win the league. And that's how we're going to differentiate ourselves. But so many, and I always say this, like I've said this so many times, but it's so only one team can actually win. So the question becomes like, what is the actual strategy to build a successful team, and how do you sort of measure that in 2023? Because I would say that, for example, like a team like 100 Thieves, their roster on paper, no one is going to say that team's going to win. But 100 Thieves for years and years and years were supposed to be like the talent development promotion org, right? They're the first one with a third tier team. They've had Sniper. They won the bid for Sniper. They had Tenacity. They had Kenvi. You saw them like put players in when their team was struggling. All of these things. Um, and then that was like a big part of their platform. But we never actually saw those players consistently start in LCS. And now suddenly we have Sniper, who's been a in the 100 Thieves system for so many years. We have Meech, who's a brand new rookie. Quid, who's a younger player who they brought in and have kind of stuck with. And then they have like Ayla, who was just in the tier 2 system like the year before, right? This was his first year of LCS. So this is a much more what you would expect from the 100 Thieves platform, built like 5 years later, 4 years later, right? So that's like one way to look at it, is kind of what identity do we want to have now that we don't have the luxury of just buying the best players. So yeah.
100 Thieves is really interesting. Obviously, I think the team that everyone's going to want us to talk about is C9. Because early, like on paper, and then also early, like reports, have been like it's C9 and then everyone else,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But I think like if you're looking at like obviously this team is built to win.
I would
But
argue
if
it's not, but
well, I'm looking if
yeah.
I'm looking at C9 and I'm like, what does this team kind of want to do? C9 has been, and again, I'll use my friend's thing as an example, where he's an LCS fan who churned out. He doesn't watch LCS anymore. He just watches Worlds like very casually. And he said, "Oh, I was a fan of C9 because of like Sneaky High and Meteos, right?" And one thing that C9 has consistently done since those very early years, even though I think some of their fans have churned out, obviously, and maybe they just watch Meteos's co-stream or the dive now. He's on that.
Yeah.
But I think the big thing is they're really good at branding the players they have under the C9 umbrella. And C9 currently is one of the only, I think, like really successful org like brands
Mhm.
that we have in terms of like what they still kind of want to be, which is still obviously a team that wins, but a team that does have fun on stage and in content. Um, they're very consistently trying to promote that idea. And this roster just has a lot of like star power
Yep.
across the board. Like between Vulcan returning, who obviously he has his own brand,
Yep.
JoJo has his own brand. Everyone on this team has like
Pudge's
a
brand
pretty
is very huge,
brand
right?
across the
Yeah.
board. Yeah. So
See,
like
yeah.
it's a lot of big personalities that are made to sell themselves to fans.
Yep.
And I think that's one thing that the C9 org just since the very early years when they just kind of lucked out with having this roster that was really funny and like really fun. Um, they've turned that into this kind of star powered vehicle that I think you see this roster iteration being another version of.
That's my main argument is most people see this and they think, oh, this is a super team that's built to win LCS and led with like the past years of those. But I would say that this is a team that isn't hiding the fact that it is built be to basically get all of the social interactions. Like Fudge, it is more about brand, in my opinion, the way the roster is constructed than winning. And historically, I think if you look at the way that rosters are constructed in NA, they are more about brand than winning because you see the rosters that people come out with every year, and on paper, you're like, this team doesn't make any sense together. But hey, they have Bjergsen and Doublelift and like all of these players who are going to get us sponsors, who are going to get us clicks, who are going to be good in YouTube videos, right? So I think that that's this team. I think kind of knows that it is that, as opposed to just we're here to win only. Because I think that that's not how you're going to make money ever again. The model hasn't worked. Sponsors are not saying, "Oh, this team is winning. I'm going to invest anymore." They want to see the brand identity. They want to see the engagement they can get. So that's what I feel like this team is, and that's kind of what teams were without it being explicit in the past. So I think that that's kind of how I see this team and its goal, as opposed to just winning everything, which I assume they will. But I, I mean,
I think
we'll
done my
see.
like I mean there's always the potential of a collapse, I guess, but like
Yeah.
I haven't done my power rankings
Hmm.
yet, but spoilers, they're number 1 on my LCS power rankings.
I mean, the interesting
Continue the LCS for the rest of those.
I think the most interesting thing for me about the C9 roster is that most people will look at it and say it's a super team, but it's not a super team because it's keeping a core of 3 players that have worked together for years and were like slowly put together, right? Like the Fudge Blabber, Berserker, and then previously Vulcan and JoJo have worked together. I think the most questionable synergy is probably going to be like JoJo Blabber as a duo. We'll see how that goes, but I think that that's in general you already see how that this team can function together because so many pieces have played together in recent memory. But you also see all of these players have very clear personalities. All of these players make a lot of sense from a brand perspective. So it's not a super team, but I will say it also kind of like has some hallmarks of a roster that you can imagine would crash and burn. But the biggest problem is who is going to beat them, and I don't have a good answer to that one. So yeah,
Yeah, you have to find like
yeah. You have to find a
another
team that you
team
think
who's
will.
working well enough who
Mhm.
won't crash and burn themselves.
Yep. So it's an interesting one because when you're actually rating the teams and thinking about who will win and lose, there's not really a dark horse that you see beating C9, even if you can
No.
foresee a situation where C9 are not like the best team ever, right? But that is because
Yeah.
a lot of the strategy for roster building had to be a lot more thoughtful than just spending all the money this off season. So yeah. Is there a roster that you actually like that isn't C9 in terms of how they're constructed and how they're put together and what you think they'll be.
In terms of doing well, or like in terms of just some of the names on the paper are kind of interesting to me because
The
like
roster being put together and like you can see what
oh
the goal is, right? You can see the goal of the roster, right? Not necessarily you think this team will be very good. I mean, if you want to talk about a team that you think will be very good, go for it. But I think it's more, I'm more interested in like understanding the strategies and what went into building the rosters these year.
yeah, I mean, I think honestly a lot of these rosters have like half of an idea and then they just kind of added the players that they could afford to add. Obviously I think the other team that everyone's gonna kind of point to as like a, because I feel like when we talked about, and maybe this is hyping it up from the broadcast standpoint as well, but when we talked about the EG winning team, it was okay, what do we have on this roster that works? Like established veterans with really talented rookies. And I think since that happened, you see shades of that. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I'm just saying you see shades of that in like every roster that we look at here, right? Because you have like, for example, FlyQuest, very experienced topside. Bwippo and Inspired are two people who also have incredibly strong voices on every team that they've been on. Jensen is incredibly experienced mid laner, and then you have Masu, who is like unequivocally the most valued prospect of this past year coming up. He's incredibly, I've actually watched Masu. I think he's incredibly talented. And then Busio, who's in his second year of LCS. So you have the not necessarily rookie bot side, but you have a very young bot side, and then the experience kind of hopefully stable top side to, you know, integrate them into this is how you play the game. This is, we're going to like expand everything, but you're already really talented and we're also going to make the most of that. You also see shades of that in Team Liquid, I think. I know Umti is new for a lot of people, but he has been around for a really long time. He's an incredibly experienced player. I love him. So I'm obviously biased. I think he's a really fun personality. I've been following his career, which has been kind of cursed for a while.
Cursed, or is he bad?
I mean, in terms of the teams he's been on, cursed. In terms of his actual gameplay, he's obviously been outclassed by a lot of LCK junglers. But then it's the same thing here, right? Where you have Umti, Impact, and Core as like the veterans, and then Yon in his second year and APA. You can also kind of see that in Dig. Dig is really weird to me, but I'm very curious to see how they perform because they themselves came into Asset Day actually super confident. Additionally, Tomo and Isles have been kind of tearing up Champs Queue.
Tomo's very good in lane.
Yeah, I think that is like a team that could definitely maybe pop off early in the season when people are still trying to figure out like what's going on. Maybe not, but I am interested in seeing how XU does. I think he's like, I think two things can be true. I think XU can improve as a player, and I also think he can be outclassed by a lot of the junglers in the LCS. So he's gonna have a tough time, I think, but I am very curious because I've been following his career for a while since he subbed in during the preseason tournament, which I wish we still had, but we don't anymore in LCS.
I think it's gonna be between XU and UMT as to who's the worst jungler in LCS, but we'll see. You know, they could all both pleasantly surprise me. Pleasantly. I think.
No, I mean the jungle pool is pretty stacked.
I definitely am rooting for XU because I think he was quite good in his first academy split. It's just I need to continue to see the progression. And again, it's like kind of hard because he didn't play at all last split, but he's kind of been for all splits for his time in academy. He was kind of the same player. So I'm very curious to see his development because I do think he's smart. I do think he has like a decent idea on improvement and focus. So I would like to see that kind of translate into making him a very strong jungler. So we'll see. I think that's sort of, for me, like I have a very clear image in my head of all of the logic that went into every team. 100 Thieves is very much okay. They already committed to promoting Sniper as soon as they
Yep.
got him for Academy. He was already committed basically to promoting to LCS this year. That was more or less a done deal. Um, and then they decided to go for kind of rookies in their bot lane and having a jungler that they think can maybe be a mentor figure. Or I think it was mostly just River was suddenly available,
Yeah.
and unexpectedly available, so he got slotted in. But the rest of the roster to me is like, okay, we're taking more of a gamble on less experienced players who we find some promise in. We're going for Golden Glue, who's mostly done a lot of secondary league coaching.
Yep.
So yeah, I think that makes sense to me on paper. Cloud9, very high brand value roster, like getting like some of the biggest names in LCS and putting them on the team. And obviously, because you said they're so good at branding, three of those players happen to already be in the org. So that is how it works. Dignitas, I heard a lot of interesting things about that one. I think that um, Bakery is a GM that I have a surprising amount of respect for, considering how much people hate Dig in the community, or how much people dislike a lot of Dig's moves, because I think he understands when to sell a player in the buyout market. So I'm very curious to see how his strategy for being a GM functions in a crappy buyout market. And the way that this kind of went is okay, well, we have Rich's friends and some NA players. And I'm not really sure because yeah. So we'll see, because
Rip Dove.
they also
I
had a
actually
coach that
find
they
Dove
were gonna go with.
another hilarious
Yeah,
personality, but
yeah. FlyQuest, I think very clearly they were excited about the rookie bot lane and
mhm.
wanting to go for like a very vocal, opinionated topside, and sort of following the FlyQuest model or the EG model from before, because it's Andrew Barton, a buyer, right? Um, and then the Immortals roster is very, very clearly like, just get the Koreans. That's the way it looks to me. It's like Koreans are cheap. We like cheap rosters. We'll see like how these guys do. That's very clearly kind of the thought behind it for me. And then Tactical was their best performer. Armeo
Yep.
performed unexpectedly well. I think for most people in LCS this summer. So those were the pieces that they slotted in around. But their strategy was very clearly like kind of getting, like, for those of you who don't know, it's very easy to build a roster with like LCKCL players who do not really have a future in Korea, because one, they will take extremely low pay usually, and two, you can tell NA players that they're getting a Korean teammate, and most NA players will be like, okay, cool. I don't know anything about this guy, but at least he's not Joe, who entered my solo queue game last night. So good times. Yeah, so that's that one. Energy sticking to their championship core. Um, Shopify, I think this is the team that Revan built very
Mhm.
much, like the coach. It's very clear. All players he's worked with before, um, all put into this roster. And then TL is like a combination of brand success from having someone like APA, and then keeping the kind of Korean experiment. I think Impact and Core have wanted to play together for a very long time. So I'm
Yeah.
very curious to see how that kind of clashes. Um, I will see the progression of this team as kind of like Impact versus Spawn. Um, and I'm very curious to see how it pans out. But those are like, you can kind of see the
That's
thought
an interesting way
process
of putting it.
behind almost every team roster build and how it happened and how it ended up the way it is. So I'm very curious just to see how it pans out. I guess my favorite ones in terms of thought process and branding is just like 100 Thieves staying consistent to their brands, TL to an extent staying consistent to their brand, even though I think the experiment was kind of a failure. Overall, we'll see. We'll see how they do in year 2 of it.
Yeah.
So I think that those are more or less like what I'm expecting in terms of the builds and the identities. Um, if you were a GM, right? Okay, Emily,
Oh
I'm
god.
gonna quiz you on this one. Let's say you're a GM going into this off season, and your owner says, um, you can only pay, I'm not going to say the amount of money because I think most people don't know, but you can only pay like a little over LCS minimum, let's say. So like you have to build a relatively affordable roster. So you're not going to be able to get like the big brand names, right? Um, what kind of strategy or thought or branding do you think is most appealing? And what type of roster would you ideally like to build?
I would, if it's like solely about branding and like
It's just about roster building
because
strategy, right?
because of that,
Yeah.
yeah, this would actually legit be my roster building strategy. I would take a look at
Mm-hmm.
if every player from Disguised was available to just promote that entire roster, but take them from like the Disguised brand and see if that would work. Like essentially promote the entire team where a lot of the development has already been done for me in terms of hopefully making these players
Mm-hmm.
have some sort of brand identity or value, and then translate that into, hey guys, we promoted the Disguised Toast roster, here they
Sure.
are, and literally just promote them as that, like, which probably isn't a good strategy for the brand of whatever I'm trying to promote, but to get people actually interested in my team,
Yep.
I think that would be the most successful avenue that I can think of with like a budget.
Unfortunately, you are not going to compete with Shopify on salaries. But, so you would
Damn
not be
it.
able to get, so you're not getting fake God and Zazel. But the thought is
Damn
there,
it.
you know? I mean, that is legitimately, I mean, I'm not going to like, I know at least one team at one point, I'm not going to say which one, um, considered just basically taking the Fear roster. When
Okay.
they had like very little money, and Fear was a team that is exciting, has a lot of not just NA talent, but also NA talent that doesn't require P1, um, which is a distinction because P1s do cost money even for Canadians, unfortunately, and we were
Yeah.
in like that phase of the off season where Canadians being like an extra $6,000 or whatever was a discussion point for some reason. Um, so very much like that is a roster that was appealing, I think, for. So that strategy is definitely something that was debated or considered. I think unexpectedly, because so many people had to go a lower budget route, it was a very interesting time period because you were basically just waiting for rosters who spent a lot to see what was left over, right? So you could have something in mind, like I'm gonna go and buy the DSG roster, but then
Yeah.
okay, well, Shopify suddenly is taking half of that roster. So what's my strategy going forward? Do I still like the pieces that are left over? Is that gonna succeed? I don't know if it necessarily will because I think a lot of the leadership was Zazel that made
Mhm.
that roster effective. So it's an interesting one because for sure I think you have to have like a way to differentiate yourself from a branding perspective in the forefront because for most of the teams you're not going to spend a lot of money, get really strong players. You're going to have to deal with the pieces that you have left over. So yeah.
Yeah. I think from a like branding perspective, just in the way that the community
Mm-hmm.
has shifted in terms of like what players they want to follow, and also going back to a lot of the things that we were talking about with trying to like establish a team or some sort of player in the LCS that younger players can look up to
Mm-hmm.
who are actually on the solo queue ladder and kind of inspire them to do better. Um, I would definitely play into that because I think, like, again, to your point, the Fear roster would have been a pretty good idea as well. Like,
Mm-hmm.
Perry has been a really interesting, not just jungler, but personality
Yeah.
since I remember him from the final Scouting
Did you
Grounds
know
event that
that
we.
he can put his leg on his neck or whatever? Anyway.
Wow! No, I had no idea.
Good times.
That's like
Yeah.
his thing, right? Like
Yeah.
that's his one. Like if he's in the movie The Lobster, that's his one trait. But
Sure.
anyway, sorry, I don't know how many people have even watched that movie.
It's a great movie.
Um,
Anyway, continue.
I was doing my like pre-poor things deep dive, you know.
Hmm.
So this roster, like obviously Shochi was massively hyped up. Philip had his little rent a girlfriend moment that I like loved from
Yeah, yeah. Then he
his
kind of
little thing. So
backpedaled
like
it, unfortunately.
I'm sad about that, but
Yeah.
yeah, like I feel like if you have that moment, he can go back actually into LCS. He performed better than even his coaches kind of had expectations for in
Mm.
terms of how he fit with that FlyQuest team. So that wouldn't have been a bad roster to promote in full, right? And just like see how it goes.
Yeah, I think Fear, crucially for me, also is a team that they the way they work together is stronger than the players individually.
Hmm.
So I'm very, for example, like a lot of people have the new DSG roster, which is three members of that Fear roster or two members of that Fear roster rated pretty highly. And I'm actually very curious because I can see that roster not functioning that well, right? Or um like all of those elements not necessarily clicking together. So for me, I'm very curious to see how the individual pieces of Fear function in 2024. But that's a separate topic, definitely a separate topic. But I do think that that's definitely a strategy that some GMs would have just tried, right? Instead of going
Hmm.
in, grabbing a couple players that you know are good from different NACL teams, just trying to go with the brand momentum and not build everything from scratch. Just go with, okay, well this is a unit. We can work on their brands. We can get a lot of press for having like promoted a full team from NACL.
Yep.
So I think that when that's something that everyone is kind of like demanding, so there's definitely that case to be made. Not the rented girlfriend. Um, Apparently, Poor Things is an all-time great film. I have not seen it yet,
I haven't
so
seen yeah, I haven't seen it yet either.
we should go see it together. You know,
Let's do
I'm
it.
down. All right. Let's see. Next one. Okay.
I'm a
Well,
big
let's talk about individual players that we're excited about that were not in the LCS last split. All right. So newer players. So this includes either promoted players or you could say someone like Jensen who or Bwipo who's making a comeback, or even Inspired. The entire FlyQuest roster, basically. Speaking, small tangent by the way, very free hype for 100 Thieves versus FlyQuest. Both bot laners on each team kind of have the same storyline. So it's Ayla versus Busio, winner of NA's of Academy 2023
Oh yeah.
versus MVP of Academy 2023 or 2022. And then you have Masu versus Meech, who is winner of NACL 2023 versus MVP of NACL 2023. So it's the same story for both of the bot laners 1 year later. So it's very free, and very easy to market. Just saying. So I'm sure you guys will want to talk about like Whippo or something, but whatever you want.
um we have a lot less time. I am still trying to find out where I fit on the broadcast. That's why I'm going into casting.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I am actually just having talked to him at Asset Day
Yep.
and having watched him. I think the player I'm honestly the most excited for. And you can say that I mean, not necessarily buying into the hype, but just curious
Yeah.
because he was so hyped for so long is Sniper.
Mm-hmm.
When I talked to him, he was really thoughtful
He's very well spoken.
about
Yeah.
yeah, about his answers towards like just generally how he sees the game, what top lane is going to be. Um Having watched LEC this past weekend, I think some of that definitely came to fruition. So just, you know, he seems like someone who at the very least studies his role as a top laner and is able to speak to what kind of top laner he wants to be, and also what kind of role top lane has overall in his opinion. Um, and yeah, I just generally really enjoyed talking to him for those reasons. And I'm very curious to see how he does. I think he might end up having a little bit of a tough time because obviously this roster is not expected to go super far. Um, but I do think it is. I'm like very like curious and cautiously optimistic for his debut for those reasons.
Yep. I think for me, I have to say Fake God because gotta shout out my boy Aaron. He's back. Okay.
Wait, can I just say someone's like he improved his interviews and I'm like, "No,
That's terrible.
we need the old
I mean, he did.
interviews."
He like because I talked to him a little bit off and on as I generally do this last year. And some of the big appeal for him was like improving streaming and things like that for joining DSG and kind
Yeah.
of for focusing on a brand and learning how to stream and present himself better. That was a big appeal for him for DSG, so I assume his camera personality did improve. If you guys want, so you have to rely on Shaden for cursed interviews now. Anyway, he's not an LCS, rip, unlucky, but still good times.
Yeah, wow. I forgot about that Shaden interview with Mark and Russ. That was an all-timer. Aaron's interview back in 2021 was an all-timer.
Oh yeah, it was a good time.
I remember you messaging me afterwards and you're like, "God damn it, I told him to be better." I'm like, he can't give these answers. I was like, oh no.
But I think he's doing. I mean, the thing for me about Fake God is he's definitely a player I can see having like a Dokla-esque redemption story, right?
Yeah.
He had a terrible time in LCS, and I think he's someone you could see as being like the most improved for players who have played LCS before to now. It's kind of like my prediction is that he will be kind of the most improved of sort of that group. In terms of the rookies, I mean, Masu is by far the most obvious answer. Everyone's gonna say Masu. He is the most exciting player, who's brand new, who's coming up, and like he's someone that we were very interested in on EG going into the 2023 summer already, but FlyQuest. It was very clear that FlyQuest were committed to him, and we're thinking about him for 2024. Even then, so I'm like he'll have like a good support system behind him. Inspired obviously has already worked with like an 80 carry of a similar kind of on paper strengths and weaknesses, being like not necessarily super vocal, but like poor landing phase, extremely good team fighting. I won't say that he's gonna have like the same highs as Danny, but Masu has like kind of a good support system to build him up. Plus, he's already performing pretty well. So I think that's definitely a player that everyone will have on their list. But for me, I'm obviously have to be excited for my boy Aaron making it back to the stage. So good times. He had a saga. Went back to school, did some fun doodles, made it back to academy, posted a twit longer, all the good stuff. So
yeah,
the classics. Also, his mother is very supportive and very fun, so you guys should do content with his mom.
Yeah, I heard. So actually, unironically, I heard his entire family is coming to support Shopify. So like, they're probably going to be a very large contingent in the audience that will definitely point out, if not interview.
Yeah, I think that's something that would be very fun. Is just also incorporating families, incorporating like more of those stories whenever possible. I know you guys are gonna have even less downtime, but definitely
I will try my best.
I think there's like some fun things you can do with pips, like for sure, like in game. Yeah. There's a lot more fun things you can do with pips. There's also a lot of really fun things that you can do to bring storytelling into the cast itself. I feel like I have heard, and you can just sit there silently so that you don't feel like you're leaking anything. And
I feel like I need to cover my face because I'm actually like very expressive. I'm not a good liar. I'm not a good liar.
You're not complicit in this at all because I didn't even hear it from you. So, I have heard that the story meetings are a lot more inclusive. In the past, one of
Yeah.
my big issues with the LCS story meetings was it was very fragmented and it was like desk only in terms of story meetings. So there wasn't a lot of consistency from storytelling between casting and desk. So I think that if that's the case, hopefully we'll see a lot more stories bleed into the cast itself, and it'll be a lot more like fun from that perspective. So I'm excited for that.
No, yeah,
Yeah.
I can attest to that.
Yeah.
And then obviously I'm gonna try
Mhm.
to make the transition into casting myself. Fingers crossed. So
Yeah, well, those were most of our topics. I think this is already a long episode, and if we're gonna continue doing this, we can save some fun topics for the
yeah.
future. So, before we sign off, Emily Rand, what is are you gonna give us any teasers for the LCS broadcast in 2024?
Oh man.
Yep.
I'll just talk about stuff that like I'm actually a part of
Okay.
because or like I don't even know how many people will be interested in this, but Draw My Life is hopefully going to get souped up to actually be
Good.
like paintings. Which is obviously going to take longer, but the art will be more detailed and the stories will be more detailed, so hopefully that's a spoiler. For all like 5 of you who are interested in that. Yeah. Um and
I
then
love Draw
yeah,
My
I mean
Life.
it's kind of what you said where like obviously we're going to have less time on desk, so a
Mhm.
lot of the narrative storytelling is going to be going to cast, and it's actually thus far like our meetings have been really cool. I mean all of the people I work with. I don't think I've made a secret about that, about how much I like the LCS team as a whole. And it actually is really nice to have the casters in the room being like, here's what I heard, here's what I want to talk about, here are like overarching narratives, what should we focus on, now that some of those like story points or narrative points might be going to cast.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing I've been trying to work on is looking at what graphics like Huya and some of the Chinese streaming sites have in terms of like bump outs or like basically small ways to do narrative storytelling that
Yep.
aren't super intrusive into a cast, and casters can kind of choose whether they want to talk about it or not through graphical elements and stuff. So
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of potential in pips other than asking coaches awkwardly about how they feel about their drafts. So I think
yeah.
that there's a lot of things that could go. Like I was talking to the NACL guys about this recently, and one of my favorite segments was actually when it was a game that didn't matter because both the teams were eliminated and couldn't advance the playoffs. So we made it fun by doing like predictions for how many kills players would get in the game. And in the game, when the players that the casters were betting on got kills, we would pip up Kangas and draw the numbers on his head. So, and tally the numbers on his head. It was a great segment. So, I'm not saying you should do that, but I'm saying there's like a lot of room to be kind of creative and have a little bit more fun with like the
Yeah.
pips, especially with reduced downtime between games. So, yeah.
The pre-recorded segment I really want to steal, and he did say we could steal it, is the bot
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah.
thing that Mazel came up with, because
Hmm.
I think that is just amazing.
Yep. There's a lot of good things that can be workshopped and improved, and I'm excited for you guys. But
Yeah.
before everyone goes, I am going to do a HelloFresh plug right now. Okay, so did you know that HelloFresh meals are affordable? They take away the chore of coming up with, wow, there's a thumbs up on your screen. That's
I didn't
crazy.
know that Discord would do that. That's bizarre. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt
Anyway,
your sponsor read.
continuing. See, Discord loves HelloFresh. That's why that
True.
happened. Discord loves HelloFresh because HelloFresh takes away the stress of deciding what to eat every day, makes the meals super simple and affordable, and there's so much variety of choices. You just go online, you use my code, you get a free breakfast for the rest of your enrollment, guys. Free breakfast. Now that is value. So use POGHF 1200 1-6. I'm making sure I got it correct. I did. I'm correct. And then when I let Emily go, we are going to do an unboxing, and we're going to do some LEC VOD reviews probably, or maybe we'll do some LCS tier lists because I'm bored. So we'll kind of decide from chat. But thanks, Emily. I will let you go.
Thank you.
Yep. It was
See
great having you
you
on as
next
always.
week.
Yeah, of course.